says this in verse 1. He says, "Now I watched, and when the Lamb opened one of the seven seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures say with a voice like thunder, 'Come.' And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow. And a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, 'Come.' And out came another horse, a bright red horse this time. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth. So the people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword. When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, 'Come.' And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in its hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, 'A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine.' When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, 'Come.' And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him, and they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword and with famine, with the pestilence and wild beasts of the earth." Kind of a crazy text, but hopefully it will make sense as we make our way through it and not be as scary. Well, he got the call before the sun even rose, and hurried as quick as he could to make it to the house. But as he's making his way, he's trying to make sense of all that just took place. As he entered the house, by the blank stares on everybody's faces, he realized they were trying to make sense of everything as well. Their family member just passed away. What made matters worse is this member just got out of jail 24 hours before this. Aren't you supposed to have a new beginning getting out of jail, and yet that was taken from him? Aren't you supposed to have a new future, but it was robbed from him? He didn't even have an opportunity to say hello to his mother when he got out of jail. That reunion was supposed to take that morning, but he passed away before that. And as this pastor's in this room looking at this family, they're all trying to make sense of why sometimes this life is so cruel. Here's this man who gets paid for words. He had none. Trying to process what was taking place, and he prayed over the family, loved the family, then left. What was so strange, though, is he had another appointment he had to make it to, and where he was headed was one of his members of his churches. Their family was celebrating their 3-year-old birthday party. So here he is walking into another room with a mother celebrating the life of their child, while he just walked out of a room with a mother processing the death of their child. And this whiplash of emotions was just too much. And he's sitting there trying to process, why is life so unfair? Maybe you can relate, because sometimes it does feel like life robs us of what is precious. Sometimes it robs us of our hopes and our dreams. Sometimes it robs us of our health, our wellness. Other times it robs us of the very ones we love. And we're stuck processing that same question. Why does life seem to be so cruel at times? But there's a question beyond that question that we have to deal with, and I think we've all struggled with it at times in our life, is why is there suffering taking place in this world? If there's such a God who is in control of it, why would he allow suffering to even happen? And many of us, we don't like the answer we come up with, so we try to avoid the question altogether. When we try to avoid looking at suffering or trials, we turn our heads. We don't want to open up the paper, because when we open up the paper, we're introduced to suffering. We're introduced to heartache. We're introduced to natural disasters and war and conflict and crime all happening together. But if we don't look at it, we think we never have to deal with that question. But the problem is suffering will show up at our door. It'll show up at our door or our friends or our family's doors. It's going to show up, which is going to force us to ask the question, why at times is this life so cruel if Jesus is on the throne? Well, this morning, what's so helpful is this text actually answers that question. In fact, of all of Scripture, I think Revelation chapter 6 might be the best one to answer the question of why are there trials and tribulations in this world, and yet Jesus is still on the throne. How do these correlate? And this text helps us so greatly. In fact, as we walked our way through the first two chapters, we did see some glorious things. Specifically in chapter 4 and 5, we were introduced to the throne room of God. John invites us in and he allows us to see these 24 elders who fall to the ground. He sees these four creatures who are covering their faces and they're crying out, "Worthy is the one who is seated on the throne and the Lamb to receive all glory and honor and power." That picture is going to be the most important picture in this book. Not only for the first century church as they're looking in at this book, but for us as well. And notice what God is doing. He's seated. He's seated on the throne. Yes, a sign of his absolute sovereignty over all things. Because if you're in the first century and you're a king, and your nation is out battling, you have your army out in front, what most likely would happen is you would stand. You wanted to see what was happening on the battlefield. You would peer out and you would begin to look and say, hey, do my men need reinforcement on this side? Are they winning the battle over here? You're looking and yet you're unsure, so you're pacing back and forth, wondering if you are going to win this battle and how this battle is going to end. Your standing. Our text says our God is seated. He's not pacing back and forth. He's not sweating. He's seated because he knows how the battle is going to end. There's no question for him. He's seated because he is relaxed, because his plan is working perfectly out in this world. He is not worried at all because he knows all things. In fact, the scriptures tell us that he knows even when the bird of an air falls to the ground, he knows all things, so he knows how this battle is going to end. And it ends, as we saw last week, with Jesus, the conqueror. It ends in heaven with his kingdom taking place and his people gathered together for all of eternity. He's seated. He's sovereign. He's not worried. That's the picture we need to take into chapter 6. Because chapter 6, to our eyes, looks chaotic. It looks like he's not sure what is going on. We see horses released in torment and disaster and turmoil. And we need to remember that picture of Jesus seated on the throne, because there is no such thing of chaos or turmoil to God, because he knows what's taking place. He's in control of it completely. He's sovereignly working his plan throughout the nations, pouring out his judgment and his salvation to the ends of the earth in this passage. This is what's taking place in chapter 6. He's going to tell us this is God's judgment, his plan. Remember, here Jesus is. He's opening the scrolls. He's the one who's opening each of these scrolls, and a horse comes out, and we're told, I'm going to tell you the end story. It's his judgment for the nations. It's his salvation for his people. He uses suffering to redeem us, to refine us. This is what we're seeing in this chapter, which is going to be vastly important as we're making our way through, because again, it seems chaotic. Because in our passage, we're introduced to 4 different horses this morning. And these are not your neighborly, friendly horses. These are not the horses you go up and feed carrots to. No, these are horses that are ferocious. And they're ferocious and scary to us because here they are unleashing torment on the ends of the, or releasing torment to the ends of the earth. But the question we must ask, for reading any scripture, we need to ask good questions of the text. And the question we should be asking is, when is this going to take place? Right? Is that not a good question to ask? If these horses are going out and they're releasing torment, when are they going to release torment? There's been some different views on that. As we're looking at Revelation, is you're going to take a different take on this passage dependent on your view. And there's been some views that look at this as just as a past event, that they've already released their torment. Meaning the whole book of Revelation is specifically geared to the first century church going through persecution in Rome, specifically trying to explain to them what will happen with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So as they're looking at this passage, they say, well, it's already past. This is a past event. But that's probably not the view that many of us are familiar with. Rather, the view that many of us are familiar with is probably the futuristic view, in which this is into the future, looking at something that hasn't taken place already. This is the view I grew up with, the view that says that really Revelation 1 through into 3 is past tense, and from 4 on into 21 is future tense. But there's some problems with that view as well. Specifically understanding that I can't look at a text like this and say that it applies to me differently than it would the first century church. And if you're looking at the first century church, how are they going to deal with this event? And how would this be encouraging, just showing them from 4 to 21 into the future? Here's some tribulation taking place a long time from now. But how would that be helpful to them? Specifically, as you're looking throughout the book of Revelation, there's many things that point to Rome. Revelation chapter 17, it talks about 7 hills. What would these 7 hills that this prostitute is sitting on? It would be the 7 hills of Rome for anybody living in that time. There's no way they would see it any differently. So there has to be some sense of this partaking with or during the first century church as well. Obviously, also, this future tense kind of view has led us into what I have believed is undue hysteria or undue fear when it comes to this passage. In other words, as we're looking at this book, there's been some that look at this as a sense of this is a terrifying event, and what it's led to is what I have called the left behind kind of culture, in which they're looking at this and saying, you better watch out, it's taking place soon. And we have even churches that kind of replicate these things, and you say, hey, you can walk through these events, and they kind of play it out on this theme so that what's their whole purpose? Their whole purpose is to say, this is scary, you don't want to experience this, so get right with Jesus. Here's my problem with that. If you're looking at a text like this, how does that message actually play out to people who are going through some horrible times? It wouldn't make any difference to a church that's being persecuted. Can it get any worse than having your head chopped off for Jesus? No. And those who went through World War I into World War II in concentration camps, they're looking at chapter 6 and they're saying, no, there are aspects that we're dealing with right in this moment. Can't get any worse than that. And those who went through Katrina at the aftermaths of looking for food and famine and all the chaos that was going on, there's aspects of Revelation chapter 6 in their lives. They're looking at it and saying, no, that can't be future. This is something taking place in our present. And you just make your way throughout church history. Those who are suffering and going through horrible hardships, they're not looking at Revelation chapter 6 as this scary future event. They're looking at it as a very present reality. So how can we look at this and begin to have a right view of maybe the book of Revelation, in which we're no longer creating fear after looking at the 4 horsemen in this passage? I think there's a better view to interpret Revelation, and it's a combination of the two. Meaning, there's some aspects, yes, that speak right into the first century church. They are going through hardship and persecution. And he's trying to encourage them, to give them a different perspective, a heavenly perspective of what is taking place. But then throughout church history, the church has suffered persecution over and over again, in which this passage speaks to them as well. And it also speaks to a future event all at the same time. Meaning, we're asking the question, when will these four horsemen appear? My answer is, they've already appeared. They're presently appearing, and they will appear into the future as well, increasing until Jesus' second return. So as we're looking at this passage, yes, we're seeing that what he's trying to tell us is there is this aspect of suffering and hardship that will take place in our life. One of the reasons I take this view is because you're looking at Revelation chapter 6. What's so interesting is, as we'll see in a little bit, as the horsemen come out and what they're unleashing, is it not the same thing that Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24? It's pretty identical, in which you'll take Matthew chapter 24 and you'll take Revelation chapter 6 and you overlay them. You'll see the similarities between the two. And what was Jesus saying? What was his point in Matthew chapter 24? But not his point to his church, that yes, hardships will take place in this life. You will experience suffering, but don't let those things catch you off guard. Don't let them throw you for a loop. I am still in control. I'm still seated on the throne, so don't let suffering and hardship throw you for a loop, because I am telling you beforehand, it will take place. Even with me on the throne, you will experience suffering and trial and hardship in this life. That's the first thing we need to see from this text. Revelation has been very clear to us that if you are living in the end times, which the end times begin at Jesus' resurrection in the Pentecost, and they will continue until Jesus' return. We're in this period called the end times. You look at the text, look at Hebrews chapter 1, and you look at how Peter and John talk about the end times. They're talking about it how it's present. And it begins Jesus' resurrection, and it will conclude at his return. And if you and I are, which we are, living in these end times, you and I will experience hardship. You and I will experience suffering. You and I will experience the harshness of this life. And it will take place even with Jesus on the throne. Because it's a reminder to us that this life is hard and it's difficult. Even with Jesus with us, we will experience these things. In fact, notice what we see first with these horsemen, because this is going to describe to us, chapter 6 is going to describe to us what kind of life we should expect here while living in the end times. He's saying here, this is it. This is what life will look like until I return. He begins to disclose kind of marks and character traits of a fallen world. And he begins here with this first horse. We see it in verse 2, a rider who comes out. The rider is a white horse. Many would think that this would be Jesus. After all, we see him on a white horse in Revelation chapter 19, but it's not Jesus. It's a very different person. This is one who is unleashing a sense of conquest or war upon the nations. In fact, many, because he looks like Jesus, they would see and kind of overlap it again with Matthew chapter 24 and say that he kind of symbolizes the Antichrist or false Christ that will be part of this world. As 1 John would also say that we've experienced many antichrists as he's looking out these false sense of false Christ that come to this earth. And notice the color. He's wearing white, a color of surrender. But there's a play on words that we see in verse 2. Notice what they say. He's came out conquering and to conquer. Jesus' words, we just saw he was the conqueror in chapter 5, but now there's this play on words that he's not conquering like the lamb that was slain. He's doing the exact opposite, showing nations conquering other nations, very similar to what we find in the second horse in our passage. The second horse, we're told, is a red horse, a symbol of blood. As we're told in verse 4, what does it say? That this horse was permitted to take peace from the world, so that people should slay one another. And he was given a great sword. So we have bloodshed. We have conflict. We have civil disputes that are taking place. And have we not seen this? The same thing Matthew chapter 24 would say, there would be rumors of war and war taking place in this world. And he's saying these things are going to take place. Do not be surprised by them. In fact, as you're looking at Matthew chapter 24, he says, when lawlessness increases, the love of man will grow cold. And we're seeing this within our own society, and we've seen it in the past. Mankind's love without Christ is growing cold. But the horsemen are not done. There's a third horse. This horse is black. Notice what it says in verses 5 and 6. When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine." What is taking place? It's injustice that leads to famine. As you're looking at the text, what's actually taking place is if you're looking at first century times, there's inflation that has increased from about 10 to 13%. A denarius would be one man's daily wage, and yet the quart of barley would be a day's ration of food. So in the text, it's literally saying a man is trying to provide food for himself, but it's taking his entire day's wage to just provide food for himself, not his family, himself. And because of the injustice, the inflation that's taking place, notice what the rich are doing. It says, "Do not harm the wine or the oil," which is an interesting fact. You just go 2 years prior to what many believe Revelation was written in. We see Domitian. Domitian had a shortage of corn, and he had a surplus of wine. So here his people don't have food what they need, or the animals don't have food. So what he did is he decides he's going to cut back some wine production and have his men begin to produce corn. Well, there was riots. The rich people said, "We don't want that." So what they did, Domitian had to take back his what he was trying to do, and not provide more food, but actually provide more wine and olive oil for the rich. So in essence, we're seeing the injustice of class systems in which the rich does not care about the poor. No, they're concerned about their wine and their olive oil, while the poor doesn't even have enough money to provide their daily food. He's saying this is what's going to take place in the time after me, when he first arose, until the time he comes to return. But there's one last horse that we see in our passage. Verse 7 and 8, the fourth horse. When he opened the fourth seal, I heard a voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death. And Hades followed him, and they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill them with sword, and with famine, and with pestilence, and with wild beasts of the earth. And the picture here is a horse of sickness. The original language speaks of a greenish kind of gray color, a greenish yellow color. Think of the emoji throw up thing on your phone. The same color it gives, this green color of sickness. Nobody likes that color. Here's this color of this horse, a horse that brings death. And it's the consequences of the first 3 horses that he would bring. And this fourth horse, he would bring this sense of killing with sword and famine and pestilence and wild beasts on the earth. So catch the picture. I know it's not a fun picture to look at, but it will make sense in just a little bit. Jesus is opening each scroll. And upon each scroll being opened, the seal on the scroll, one scroll, 7 seals. He's opening each seal, and as the seal is opened, a horse goes out. And another horse goes out, and another horse goes out until you get 4 horses. We'll cover the rest next week. And he's looking and he's saying, "No, I need you to be prepared. This is what it's going to look like in the end times of which you're living in." He said, this is what it's going to feel like. There's going to be suffering and heartache and pain. And you shouldn't be thrown off by the military destruction, the civil disorder you see, injustice or famine and death. Those things shouldn't throw you for a loop, because Jesus says, "I warned you of them." I gave you the warning. Right? I told you these things are going to take place, and guess what? They're happening, so you shouldn't be thrown off. Instead, you should stand firm and be faithful. Remember what we talked about last week? The whole lesson of Revelation is saying your life is going to be hard. Jesus conquered, so you can be okay, so therefore be faithful. That's what he's saying in this passage. He's saying these are hardships that will take place in your life. These things are going to take place, but you don't have to worry. And that's important. Because again, he's warning his church. Because again, what throws Christians faster than anything else? Is it not trials and suffering and tribulation? Is this not what wrecks our faith sometimes? Where we have questions. We wonder, where is God in the midst of our heartache? And imagine him writing to this first century church, and I imagine them having these questions as well. How long do you have to be in prison, away from your family, before you begin to ask the question, God, why are you allowing this to take place in my life? Is this how you treat people who are faithful to you? Is this how you treat your children that you love? Have you asked those questions yourself? That's the question of John the Baptist. Right? He's thrown into prison. He turns and he sends the disciples to Jesus. He says, are you sure you're the Messiah? Because I had different expectations. And yet here I am in prison. Jesus says, yes. Yes, I am the Messiah. I'm giving you these warnings beforehand. There will be hardship. There will be trials. There will be tribulation, but you do not have to worry because I am sovereign. I'm the one who's seated. I'm working my plan out in the world. In fact, what's so interesting about this passage is why we begin to see it the way I think we should interpret it is notice who's in control of the horses. Did you notice in our passage? Who's in control of the horse? This is the questions we should be asking of this text. Who's in control of them? Is it not the angel? Jesus' messenger who comes out and says, come. And as he says the word come, the horse obeys. The horsemen, they go out. And then he goes to the next horse, which shows his control again. He says, come, and the horse comes, it obeys. In fact, we're shown in verse 8. Notice what it says in verse 8. He was given authority over the earth. Who is giving him the authority? God. So God, we see him sovereignly in control of every aspect of this passage. He's the one who's seated on the throne. He's the one who gives these horsemen the ability to go out and create havoc on the world. He is the one in control. Which means he's sovereign over our suffering. He's sovereign over our pain. He's sovereign over the heartache we go through. He's sovereign over the entire thing. So we ask the question, if he's sovereign over it, what's the purpose of it? That's the question we should ask next. Well, what's the purpose of these horses going out? This is a good question to be asking because they are terrifying. What's so interesting is if you make your way through the Old Testament, and as you're looking at God's judgment that goes out, I'm going to give you a couple passages, you look them up at home. Jeremiah 15, 1 Kings 8, verse 33, 2 Samuel chapter 24. And there's a whole bunch of others. Ezekiel 14 is we'll look at it together. But if you're making your way through what God's judgment looks like, it's going to mimic exactly these four horsemen. Old Testament, war, famine, pestilence, and beast. God's judgment. This is what the passage is saying. Saying, what's the purpose of these horses? Twofold. He's sending these horses. He's saying, this is my judgment across the nations to those unbelievers. Then he's going to say also that this is God's salvation plan for his people that go and endure suffering. Our God has been the one who has used suffering and heartache throughout the beginning of time to strengthen his church and refine us, just as he did the lamb that was slain. So notice in this passage, let's look specifically at Ezekiel 14. If you've got your Bibles, you can turn with me there. Ezekiel 14, verse 21. Ezekiel 14, verse 21, I'm going to read it to you. And as I'm reading this, notice the horses. I'm going to shout them out to you. Notice how it mimics exactly our passage. Ezekiel 14, verse 21. For thus says the Lord God, how much more when I send upon Jerusalem my 4 disastrous acts of judgment, sword, white horse, red horse, famine, black horse, wild beast, the pale horse, and pestilence. So he says, I send upon Jerusalem my 4 disastrous acts of judgment, sword, famine, wild beast, and pestilence, to cut off from it man and beast. But behold, some survivors will be left in it, sons and daughters who will be brought out. And behold, when they come out to you, and you see their way and their deeds, you will be consoled for the disaster that I have brought upon Jerusalem, for that I have brought upon it. They will console you when you see their ways and their deeds, and you shall know that I have not done without cause all that I have done in it, declares the Lord your God. Notice what he's saying. He's saying, I'm sending out judgment upon my people because of their disobedience, but there's always a remnant. I'm sending out my judgments upon the nations, but there's a remnant. There's a chosen group, the church, that is going to go through the same suffering and the same pain that the world goes through. But for them, it's not judgment, it's his refining and salvation and his redemption. Do you see it? This is the story of the gospel, that he's using, one sense, using these horses as his judgment across the nations. But in the same sense, he's using it as a refining fire for his people. And if I can understand that principle, it's going to transform the way I look at trials and tribulations in this life. He's sovereignly in control, working his way, what Satan wants to use for destruction, he's using as judgment for those who do not turn to him, but he's using for his people it is a refining fire to sanctify them. So when you're going through the heartache, God is turning to you and saying, no, I'm using this to refine you. Why? Hebrews chapter 12. Because he disciplines those he loves. He disciplines those he loves. In fact, let me read to you Hebrews chapter 12. These are passages that should speak to me in the midst of my heartache and my pain. I should be preaching the gospel to myself, specifically Hebrews chapter 12. Notice what it says. But he disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. For the moment, he says, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Trained by it. Meaning it's going to happen quite often if you're going to be trained by the hardships of this life. And in the text, in the context of Hebrews chapter 12, what is he talking about? Persecution. Persecution. Satan is trying to destroy the church, and God says, this is my discipline. This is how I discipline those I love, and he says I'm going to train you by it. And he says in verse 12, therefore lift up your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees and make straight the paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. He's saying, don't let this suffering that's taking place, these 4 horsemen that have been present in the past and are present now and present in the future, increasing in volume till Christ return. He says, don't let them throw you off. He says, yes, it's my judgment. He's saying, hey, I see what is taking place. He's saying to his church, he says, I see the evil taking place that's happening with you. And he says, hey, I see it and I'm judging it. We understand this is not his final judgment, these four horsemen. How do we know that? At the end, the fourth horse, he says he only conquered 1/4 of the world. And you look at Numbers and Revelation, they're all symbols. So it's not his final, it's a partial. Final judgment is when he comes back. But he's saying, I see the heartache that is taking place amongst you, and I'm judging it. But I'm also using this to refine you as a church. So your hands are not gripped tight to this world. So that you would be able to let loose and understand there's a kingdom coming far greater than anything this world offers us. He uses the suffering and the pain to say, hey, I'm bringing in something greater to you. Let me show you my strength through your weakness. If we can wrap our heads around Revelation chapter 6, this is a passage that can transform how you look at suffering and pain in this world. He's saying, don't be thrown off. I'm in control. I'm seated on the throne. And the Lamb that was slain, he conquered. And he says, if you're going to be my followers, you're going to walk the same path of your Savior. And the way you conquer, as we talked about last week, the way you conquer is just like the Lamb did. You give your lives. You love. You sacrifice. You love your enemy, the world. And what we're going to see in the book, he's leading up to this point. He's saying this judgment, it hasn't transformed their hearts. And he's going to use the plagues in a little bit of Egypt and how the plagues and how they went out on Pharaoh. And guess what? That was judgment, but it didn't transform Pharaoh's heart. And then he's going to move into this reality. The way the world is transformed is through the church as they become like the Lamb that was slain. Not by fighting back. Not by throwing our fists and saying, what are you doing? It's by loving them and giving our lives, if that's what it takes, so that they can see the gospel message. That's the book of Revelation. Your life's going to be hard. It's going to seem unfair, but Jesus conquered. And because he's conquered, you can continually be faithful because you know his kingdom's coming.